53106 is our text number. That will cost you 30 cents. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or send us an email to afternoon@newstalk.ie. We are talking in our history slot this week about the history of gun running in Ireland. Of course, it's a long and august history. We have John Gibney, who's a historian and guide on the historical walking tours of Dublin, is with us to talk about that. I suppose the heyday of gun running in Ireland is when we get into 1916 to 1921. There must have been a lot of it.
Well, there had to be. I suppose going back to what we were saying before the break, I mean, those guns that the Germans had shipped over to Ireland never made it to land. So even during the Easter Rising, there were, people were stuck for weapons. They kind of improvised, making homemade bombs, using shotguns, whatever came to hand. And there's a photograph of a British soldier after the Rising walking through Dublin with an armful of pikes. Now, these are the kind of things you use against horses and cavalry.
Yeah.
This is what you associate with 1798. And the fact that they might, rehabilitate the pike in 1916 shows just how stuck for material and weapons these guys actually were. Now, as I suppose the movement for independence intensified in subsequent years, the volunteers who, I suppose, morphed into the IRA naturally had to try and get weapons wherever they could. Now, you do get a few kind of bizarre stories before the Easter Rising of, Tommies going into pubs. A helpful young street urchin offers to hold on to their gun because they can't legally bring their gun into the pub. So the thirsty Tommy goes in, has a drink, he comes out, the gun is gone.
Yeah.
Before the Rising, guns could be bought from deserters or even sympathetic British soldiers. Now obviously as the struggle for independence and the war of independence intensified, those kind of avenues weren't really going to be as open as they had been beforehand. So the IRA was kind of in a constant struggle to get weapons. Now, some of the early phases of its attacks were attacking RIC barracks, police barracks, but the police were essentially a paramilitary police force and were armed. So it wasn't just attacking the symbol of authority. There was a very practical reality. These guys had guns and they needed them. Now, they would have managed to source some weapons on the continent after the war. It was fairly easy to do so. One obvious way of getting them back into Ireland was through the UK. Liverpool in particular was a good conduit for guns, and apparently Sam Maguire of Trophy fame was involved in gun running himself as an IRB man based in London. He apparently swore Michael Collins into the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but was apparently involved in these attempts to get guns into Ireland. Now, the most ambitious...
And would those guns have been sourced on the European mainland but brought in via Britain?
Basically, yeah. Or obtained in Britain itself. You're talking kind of... about 350 firearms came through Liverpool in the 2 years before the truce of June 1921. Probably about 60 of them were rifles and the rest would have been small handguns. So the kind of things that would be easy to get through, and probably easy to get a hold of. Not really kind of heavy material as such.
Right.
But by that time, the truce in 1921, a kind of new and fairly impressive weapon had been developed and had come on the market in the form of the Tommy gun. Renowned for its role in, Chicago gangsterism and gangster movies from the 30s onwards. And the Tommy gun had been invented by a US colonel as a kind of a trench, basically a gun for trench warfare. Something that could be used in confined spaces, something that would cause a great deal of damage in close proximity to other people. And apparently, his timing was off, so the gun was developed at the end of the war, so its natural market didn't take off for a couple of decades. It was only really until in the Second World War that the British and American armies started to buy the Tommy gun in any substantial numbers. Now, before that, the first major customer, and probably the only major customer for the gun for the first couple of decades of its existence, was the IRA. Now, someone had apparently seen advertisement for the gun in a newspaper somewhere. Of all things,
You'd think it kind of takes place in a far more murky fashion, but I've just seen an advert for Tommy guns.
Apparently the submachine gun was actually... The US government didn't crack down on them until 1933, after Prohibition. So, it's business is business.
Yeah.
They had to sell the damn things. And the IRA took an interest in them, and especially Michael Collins' associate Harry Boland, who was particularly enthusiastic and ordered 653 of them at a combined cost of, at that time, $132,634.
Genie.
I haven't done the sums as to what that's worth today, but it's a pretty penny nonetheless. Now, about 495 of them were meant to be shipped from New York in June 1921, and apparently were to be disguised as legs of lamb, in sacks. Now, this is where things went badly wrong, because they were apparently left on the deck of the ship, and apparently a cook opened up one of the bags and was rather surprised by what he found. Now, the guns were seized, and there were attempts to retrieve them. US Customs seized them. There were attempts to claim they were stolen property and therefore Customs shouldn't actually use them. But they were basically off the scene until 1925. Now that was about 495. There was another 60 or so left, and many of them tried to get into Ireland, or were brought into Ireland. Some through Liverpool. The IRA were trying to buy weapons wherever they could, especially in Germany and Italy after the war, and they had this constant trickle of guns coming into the country. Now, the Tommy gun, I mean, it's ironic because by the time it turned up in Ireland, the Anglo-Irish War, the War of Independence, was essentially over. And apparently it wasn't actually that effective, because it wasn't designed for the kind of ambushes the IRA carried out, which involved, long distances on country roads, firing at people. This was a weapon that was meant to fire in small, confined spaces. So ironically enough, it's the image more than the reality. Like, the Tommy gun it's a fairly iconic thing of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Now, apparently, some of them on the way into Ireland did go AWOL. And in the 1930s, it was reported in US newspapers that the serial numbers of some Tommy guns that had been seized in gang warfare during Prohibition matched the serial numbers of some of the guns that were on that ship in June 1921. So it's quite possible that the IRA's Tommy guns went missing and ended up in, the hands of, the Chicago gangsters we all know and love. It's quite possible. Certainly, there seems to have been some connection there. And it kind of makes sense. Like, they're knocking around. Someone is going to make use of them.
Yeah. But I assume the same arms then would have gone on to be used in the Civil War then?
Somewhere. And some, in fact, even popped up in the 1950s and at the end of the 1960s. I mean, old, antiquated, weapons that were basically sitting around for decades not being used. But they did pop up again.
But Tommy guns, though, wouldn't have made that much of a difference one way or the other, I suppose, rather than the notion that people had them.
Probably not. I mean, they look good.
Yes,
but I mean, the practical reality is another story entirely,
Somebody, John on Twitter says, police reports from North Cork in 1910 testify to firearms being brought home by returning immigrants, which led to serious rioting in Newmarket. Rioters had 3 times as many guns as the RIC. There's a texter. Somebody else says, I think Ryan's daughter is terrific. The lovey-dovey carry on aside, the cinematography is fab. And a movie buff says The Storm that she spoke of in Ryan's daughter was filmed off the coast of Africa because they couldn't get a decent storm off the Kerry coast.
That's surprising, but
learn something new every day, don't you? Just kind of to flip it forward into more recent history, say that the Martin Ferris, where the guns he was involved with, where did they come from?
The US again, apparently allowed them through Boston, and supposedly through the infamous Whitey Bulger. At least this is the kind of tabloid version of it.
Yes.
Put onto the Marita Ann, his fishing boat, and then seized off. Put onto a merchant ship first, then onto the Marita Ann, and then, seized in 1984 off the coast. I was old enough to remember that case, and I remember the Marita Ann sitting up in Howth in the dry dock for a couple of years at the end of the 1980s as well. But, I mean, the Provisional IRA, and their loyalist counterparts had to do the same thing, get guns into the country. I mean, say, in the late 80s, the Libyans were a huge source of weapons, Semtex most notoriously. The Libyans had tried to send weapons over to the IRA in the 1970s. And the IRA had been trying to buy weapons in the States, like, surface-to-air missiles and things. I mean, very often, the kind of links that have been used in previous generations could be revived and used again. The same kind of circles, the same kind of networks. I mean, guys who tried to get weapons for the provisionals in the early 1970s were people who'd been involved in gun running decades earlier in these Irish-American militant circles. So in a way, it's kind of history repeating itself. There's nothing new under the sun.
And I suppose to agree, it depends on immigrant communities as well, because one place, say for instance, was that a loyalist could get guns from South Africa. Presumably there were links there anyway.
There might have been, but I think that at the time in the 80s, the South Africans probably would have been happy to trade with
anyone.
Now, I think with things like the IRA, you were going to depend upon the goodwill of sympathisers in immigrant communities, Like, that could be in the UK in the early 1920s, the States in the 20s, and the States in the 70s and 80s, But you needed someone who, I suppose, was willing to go that extra yard and get to this material, Now, there's a whole ethical and moral issue relating to the use of violence, and I remember in the course of the peace process, when decommissioning became such an issue, and Republicans took the view that, it's not the guns that are the issue, it's the willingness to use them. And the worst atrocity of the Troubles was the Alma bomb, and those bombs weren't imported, they were made here, as were so many of those bombs. So in a way, like, the whole question of gun running, you can almost divorce it from the morality and ethics of, violence or paramilitary activity, up to a point, because it is the technicality There is, of course, the willingness to use these weapons, and we have seen, weapons cause appalling human suffering on this island over the course of the past century. But it's a curious little footnote. It's the nuts and bolts and mechanics, I suppose, of how these things actually happen.
It's fascinating, I must say. John, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us today about it. That was John Gibney there. He's a historian and guide on the historical walking tours of Dublin. Here's Tara with the news.